country and always appeared with a smiling and a serene countenance. But Demosthenes had constant care and thoughtfulness in his look and a serious anxiety, which he seldom, if ever, laid aside, and therefore was accounted by his enemies, as he himself confessed, morose and ill-mannered. The way you appear carries weight, right? Let's now continue. Our final two chapters of the Harvard Classics, Plutarch's life, is Caesar and Mark Antony. First to Caesar. So much of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is, of course, here. Born, of course, 12 or 13 July 100 BCE, of course, dies the Ides of March 15th of March 44. He's the great general, the great historian. He's a great writer in the Latin prose as well. The Gallic Wars come to mind. Often, of course, he is blamed for the ending of the Roman Republic and the creating of the Roman Empire. And as we've said, a tremendously gifted leader and politician and writer, right? The worship of Julius Caesar in many ways comes back to Plutarch, although it's unfair to say that Plutarch just kind of celebrates everything Caesar did. I mean, I think he does point out some of the faults of Caesar. We'll take a look at just a few of the really brilliant, I mean, this is an amazing chapter. These last two chapters of Caesar and Antony are both brilliant. He says this early on in the chapter on Caesar. It is said that another time, when free from business in Spain, after reading some part of the history of Alexander the Great, Caesar sat a great while, very thoughtful, and at last burst out into tears. His friends were surprised and asked him the reason of it. "Do you think," said he, "I have not just cause to weep when I consider that Alexander at my age had conquered so many nations, and I have all this time done nothing that is memorable?" There's two things I want to say about this. Notice that we have Caesar, as a young man, reading a biography about Alexander the Great and believing that he needs to measure his successes against Alexander the Great, and he realizes at his young age that he has not yet done it, and therefore he is saddened and weeps. The second thing I want to point out is in our lectures on Milton. I comment on the fact that Milton is very influenced by putting a certain kind of pressure on himself quite young and saying, I have to be better, I have to be more, I have to be a greater writer, a greater person. We have something very similar going on here as well. A few lines later in this chapter, we get this. Added to this also, there was no danger to which Caesar did not willingly expose himself, no labor from which he pleaded an exemption as a leader of men, as a general. His contempt of danger was not so much wondered at by his soldiers because they knew how much he coveted honor, but his enduring so much hardship, which he did to all appearance beyond his natural strength, very much astonished them. For he was a spare man, not a soft, but had a soft and white skin, was distempered in the head and subject to an epilepsy. The falling down sickness is, of course, the way Shakespeare will call it, right? Which, it is said, first seized him at Cordoba. But he did not make the weakness of his constitution a pretext for his ease, but rather used war as the best physic against his indispositions. Of course, Machiavelli will say the same thing in The Prince. A good prince is always hunting, remember, when he's not at war to keep himself in shape. Whilst by infallible journeys, right, coarse diet, frequent lodging in the field, continual laborious exercise, he struggled with his diseases and fortified his body against all attacks. In other words, Caesar recognized that he had these challenges physically, and so he trained himself to become a stronger, hardier person, a stronger, hardier man. Numbers of people over the years, then especially men will read these, who themselves pride themselves on someday maybe becoming a great leader, and they will follow suit, right? A few pages over, we get this comment. Caesar, who above all men was gifted with the faculty of making the right use of everything in war. This was his gift. And most especially of seizing the right moment as soon as he heard of the revolt. Returned immediately the same way he went. The idea of timing is the point that we want to make here, that Plutarch says Caesar had some serious gift for understanding the timing. Finally, in a chapter of memorable lines, I'll just go to, near the very end, we get this comment. He says, Caesar, right at the end he says it like this, Caesar was born to do great things. And I mean, you can't get a better statement of the great man theory than this. Caesar was born to do great things and had a passion after honor. And the many noble exploits he had done did not now serve as an inducement to him to sit still and reap the fruit of his past labors, but were incentives and encouragements to go on, and raised in him ideas of still greater actions and a desire of new glory, as if the present were all spent. It was, in fact, a sort of emulous struggle with him, with himself, as it had been with another, how he might outdo his past actions by his future. This notion that he was always looking to somehow improve himself, of course, leading ultimately to his own death. The final chapter that we have in Harvard Classics, and again, I hope that just a little bit of the reading that we've done here will stimulate you to want you to go and find and read all of Parallel Lives. It's such a remarkable text, is Mark Antony. Titled is just Anthony, and in Parallel Lives is compared with Demetrius in Lives. And this may be the best chapter in all of Lives. Many have argued about which one is the best. The eye for detail is amazing here, and some of the storytelling moves beyond simply biography and even history to really drama. I mean, there's a reason why Shakespeare loved this chapter. And in many ways, we're gonna kind of a whole bunch of it makes sense that this would be the last chapter of if you're gonna edit this thing like this where you don't get all of them. This is a great chapter to end with. Of course, Mark Antony, born 14th of January 83 BCE and dies 1 August of 30 BC. The Roman politician in general, of course, a supporter of JC. He formed the Second Triumvirate with Lepidus and, of course, Caesar Octavian. Octavia will defeat Mark Antony, however, and Cleopatra, of course, in the Battle of Actium, the 2nd of September, 31 BC. We talk about this in our lectures on Virgil's Aeneid. The next volume, in fact, that we meet in the Harvard Classics is Virgil's Aeneid, and we'll have more to say about that. Of course, the Antony-Cleopatra story and the committing of the suicide, August 30th BC, is some of the most famous stuff as well. There's just a couple of places I'll go here to finish up. There's a whole lot of this I would love to read with you. I don't have the time, but I'm hoping that the little bit that I share with you will lead you to want to read it. He says, Antony in misfortune was most nearly a virtuous man. It is common enough for people when they fall into great disasters to discern what is right and what they ought to do. But there are but few who in such extremities have the strength to obey their judgment, either in doing what it approves or avoiding what it condemns. And a good many are so weak as to give way to their habits all the more and are incapable of using their minds. That is to say, as we have often said in 303, when bad things happen, no longer ask, why is this happening to me? But rather learn to ask, why is this happening for me? That is, of course, the key. Instead of, when bad things happen, believing, oh, I'm a victim and this world is all against me, to rather change the question and say, okay, I preferred that this not happen. But what can I learn from this? Antony, he says, is a classic exemplar of this. Near the end of this chapter, in brilliant fashion, we get some of these lines that I'll just finish here near the end. When he understood that, Antony understood that Cleopatra was alive. Again, we're back to the Cleopatra story. It's brilliant writing. It really is fun to read. When Mark Antony realized that Cleopatra was alive, he, of course, has already tried to commit suicide. He eagerly gave order to the servants to take him up, and in their arms was carried to the door of the building where Cleopatra is. Cleopatra would not open the door, but looking from a sort of window, she let down ropes and cords to which Antony was fastened, and she and her 2 women, the only persons she had allowed to enter the monument, drew him up. Those that were present say that nothing was ever more sad than the spectacle to see Antony all covered over with blood and just expiring, thus drawn up, still holding up his hands to her and lifting up his body with the little force he had left. I mean, this is pure drama. This moves beyond biography to beautiful drama, as indeed it was no easy task for the women, and Cleopatra, with all her force, clinging to the rope and straining with her head to the ground, with difficulty pulled him up, while those below encouraged her with their cries and joined in all her effort and anxiety. When she had got him up, she laid on the bed, tearing all her clothes which she spread upon him, and beating her breasts with her hands, lacerating herself and disfiguring her own face with the blood from his wounds, she called him her lord, her husband, her emperor, and seemed to have pretty nearly forgotten all her own evils. She was so intent upon his misfortunes. Now, how Plutarch can know all of this is, anybody's guess. And yet notice, he's going to create a powerful picture of the final moments of Antony and Cleopatra. And of course, we know all about from Shakespeare and elsewhere how this one plays out. Antony, stopping her lamentations as well as he could, called for wine to drink, either that he was thirsty or that he imagined that it might put him the sooner out of pain. When he had drunk, he advised her to bring her own affairs, so far as might be honorably done, to a safe conclusion, and that among all the friends of Caesar, she should rely on Procelius, that she should not pity him in this last turn of fate, but rather rejoice for him in remembrance of his past happiness, who had been of all men the most illustrious and powerful, and in the end had fallen not ignobly. And then the last line of this passage, a Roman, by a Roman, overcome. And then the very end of this story, of course, will tell us that Antony and Cleopatra buried together and the like, side by side. Well, that's Plutarch's Life in just a few moments, and I hope that these comments will lead you to say, I think I'd like to pick up and read all of the parts of Parallel Lives. Let's finish really quickly at 2a. Well, again, we become the stories that we hear, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. And Plutarch is going to give us a whole bunch of those stories. And he's going to give generations of people's stories. And even if Plutarch's not read today, certainly biography is often understood in movies about famous people and the like. Another 2a message, of course, here is the hero and the idea of hero worship is clear. The importance of models, emulation, and even imitation of models as well. At 2b, well, this is compelling prose, no doubt. Powerful word pictures, powerful similes, and an amazing eye for detail, again, and just beautifully easy to read. At 3a, well, we've mentioned so many thinkers. Obviously, you have to mention Plato and Machiavelli, or Plato versus Machiavelli. The importance of philosophic ideas lived out in real time. And then, of course, at 3a, we think a little bit about this idea of what makes a great leader, and Machiavelli's question of, is it better to be feared or to be loved? By the way, reading Plutarch will split that whole notion. Sometimes he seems to argue it's better to be loved. Sometimes he seems to say it's better to be feared. Most of the time he says it's best to be, of course, respected, some of both. Again, we've mentioned Carlyle and his influence on Emerson and the idea of the great man theory. And Emerson, as we said in our earlier lectures, Emerson very influenced by very influenced by the prose style as well of Plutarch. Finally, in 3b, the question is, well, who are your heroes? Who are the people who most influence you? And the people you look at and you say, I want to kind of be like them. And to what degree have you sought to try to emulate or in some ways build on the study of those great people? And what are the biographies that you think you probably should be studying and taking a look at? Well, speaking of heroes, we now turn in volume 13 of the Harvard Classics to Virgil's Aeneid. And again, we've pointed out, while there's no Iliad in Harvard Classics, there is the Aeneid, and this will be significant as to why. And we'll pick up with that one in our next study. I hope that you will enjoy the classic Roman text as we meet it next. Thank you. I hope you'll come back.